You were charged with killing 13 women by strangulation, and you have no idea what your defense was. Do you think I'm an idiot, Lorenzo? Do I look an idiot to you?
You're not going back. Have a good day, y'all. Thank you. All right. Here, this is y'all.
In the shadowy corners of the Northwest, a grim truth emerged. Many law enforcers regarded the lives of streetwalkers as mere garbage. If your job involves sweeping these women off the streets, it's easy to think, "This makes my life easier," noted a sex worker advocate. While no officer would openly admit such thoughts, the underlying mindset revealed a chilling indifference and unsettling reality that hinted at a subconscious devaluation of lives deemed disposable. This troubling attitude trickled down through the media and public perception. When Gilyard claimed his final victim, Connie Luther, in the winter of 1993, her murder barely registered a scant 100 words buried on page 6 of the Kansas City Star. The nude body of a Kansas City woman was found Monday on a sidewalk, the report stated, stark and impersonal, reflecting the pervasive indifference towards the lives lost in the shadows. Connie Luther, just 29, was found at around 6:30 a.m. near 25th and Allen Streets. Investigators suspected she was killed elsewhere. A passing driver, unaware of the horror, discovered her nude body, face down in the snow, hidden among leaves and trash. Police were left with no suspects, no motives, only a promise of an autopsy to unveil the truth behind her tragic death. Kansas City, a bustling two-state metropolitan area of around 2 million, was no stranger to crime, steeped in a history shaped by the notorious Pendergast family's blend of politics and vice since the 1880s. Yet, in the year Connie Luther was killed, the city averaged fewer than 2 homicides a week. Her murder barely made an impact, relegated to a brief mention in the back of the local newspaper, a tragic footnote in a city increasingly desensitized to violence. While reporters can only work with the details provided, those bare reports on homicides deserved far more scrutiny. Often it is the routine cases, those that slip into obscurity, that reveal the most profound truths. These overlooked stories, masked by indifference, underscore how the most chilling crime narratives often arise from the mundane, waiting for someone to shed light on the darkness. Some murders garnered more attention than others, especially during the wave of hooker homicides in 1987. Police were acutely aware they faced a serial killer, prompting a $1,000 reward, roughly $77 for each of the 13 victims. This killer was indiscriminate, preying on women aged 15 to 36. 9 were white, 4 were black. Most were brutally garroted with whatever was at hand, some with their own clothing, others with electrical cords or shoelaces, a harrowing testament to the violence they endured. The victims bore haunting signs of their struggle: cloth or paper towels stuffed in their mouths, likely to muffle their screams. Most had been sexually assaulted, their bodies marked with scratches, cuts, and broken fingernails, evidence of a desperate fight for survival. Many were found naked and missing shoes, prompting detectives to consider the chilling possibility of a foot fetishist lurking in the shadows. Victims were discovered both downtown and scattered across a wide geographic area, leading police to believe that most were murdered in one location and discarded in another. Among the first were lost teenagers ensnared in the world of street prostitution. Stacy Swafford, just 17, was killed in April 1977, her body left in a rubble-strewn lot. Gwen Kazine, at only 15, the youngest victim, was found dead in an alley in January 1980, while Margaret Miller, 17, lay abandoned in a vacant lot in May 1982. Kazine's murder drew particular attention, her youth casting a spotlight on the tragedy of lost potential. Relatives remembered Kazine as a bright, carefree girl who once attended a Holy Roller church, but she fell in with a bad crowd and succumbed to drugs, the dark companion of prostitution. A week after Margaret Miller's murder, Lorenzo Gilyard was imprisoned for a felony conviction. bringing a brief lull to the serial killings that lasted nearly 4 years. However, violence erupted again with a horrific wave of 8 murders, commencing just months after Gilyard's release. The violent spree began on March 14, 1986, when Catherine Berry's body was discovered beneath scrap plywood in a derelict building just a few miles from downtown, a familiar haunt for her. At 34, she was the only victim not engaged in prostitution, a mother of 3. Berry had succumbed to a mental breakdown that led her to the unforgiving streets. Later that year, 2 more women were murdered just 14 weeks apart. Naomi Kelly, 23, was found strangled in a Needle Park downtown on August 16th, her life extinguished too soon. Then, on November 27th, Thanksgiving Day, Debbie Blevins, 32, was discovered naked except for socks, her body callously dumped outside a church near the trendy Westport neighborhood, a stark contrast to the holiday spirit. In 1987, the grim toll continued as 5 more bodies surfaced. Ann Barnes, 36, a stripper, was discovered on April 17, Good Friday, and the 10-year anniversary of Stacey Swafford's murder. Just 7 weeks later, Kellyanne Ford, a 20-year-old addicted to drugs, was found strangled in a city park. On September 12th, the shoeless body of 19-year-old Angela Mayhew was discovered in North Kansas City. Following her, Sheila Ingold, 36, was found dead in a van on Troost Avenue, a notorious hunting ground for Johns. The year ended with the murder of Carmeline Hibbs, 30, whose body was located in a parking lot on Broadway, only 16 blocks from where Ingold had been found. Both women left shoeless on a bitterly cold December night. After that harrowing stretch, the pace of the serial killings slowed. Helga Kruger, 26, an Austrian national, was found on Troost Avenue on February 12, 1989. 4 years later, Connie Luther, presumed to be the final victim, was discovered dead in January 1993. Conventional wisdom suggests that serial killers never stop of their own accord. Their compulsion, once ignited, can never be quenched, ceasing only when they die or are imprisoned. Yet, Lorenzo Gilyard defied this grim certainty. He simply stopped, and no one knows why. Gilyard has never confessed to having even started.
You've always denied all this, despite the overwhelming evidence.
Overwhelming evidence. DNA.
DNA is pretty overwhelming.
Okay. According to the police, okay.
According to anyone that studies the DNA results.
And who else did it? But the Kansas City Police Department.
Well, let me ask you this then. If it wasn't you, who else was it?
I don't know.
Experts often point to a violent lineage, suggesting that savagery breeds more savagery, and Gilyard's family history supports this notion. His father was convicted of rape in 1970, while his sister, Patricia Dixon, a prostitute, fatally stabbed a customer in 1983 and was later implicated in another killing. His younger brother, Daryl, is serving life without parole for a 1989 drug murder, and he stands out in Missouri's prison system, paying $1,100 a month in room and board from a $4.3 million settlement received after a garbage truck accident severed his legs in 1986. Lorenzo Gilyard, a stocky 5'8" man with bare claw hands, was wired for violence. Over his lifetime, he assaulted friends, relatives, and strangers, while again and again managing to dodge hard prison time. Even as a teenager, young Gilyard was bullying and beating women, including the first of his 4 wives, whom he married at age 17 when she got pregnant. She would later say that Gilyard subjected her to 5 years of torture before she escaped. He also compiled a numbing record of at least a dozen rape accusations. 5 charges failed to stick from 1969 until 1974, the last against a stripper. Finally, in 1975, he was brought up on charges of raping a 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a friend. He was sentenced to 9 months for molestation in a plea deal. But authorities blew an opportunity to get mental help for a clearly troubled man. A psychiatrist examined Gilyard as part of a competency test in that 1975 case, according to a profile of Gilyard by Mark Morris of the Kansas City Star. The shrink noted that the twisted Gilyard insisted that he, not the adolescent, he was a victim. The psychiatrist could have required Gilyard to get help. Instead, he wrote, "It is my recommendation that Mr. Gilyard would benefit from but does not require further psychotherapy, either individual or group in nature. There is no evidence that Gilyard received methodical mental health treatment, and his pattern of violence continued. He was charged in 1979 with raping a woman while holding a gun on her boyfriend. Despite compelling evidence, a jury acquitted him. In 1980, he was convicted of assaulting his third wife, who divorced him. He then stalked and beat her twice in 1981 while the case was under appeal. Ultimately, he served time for those assaults, as well as a parole violation related to a jewelry theft. Those cases finally put Gilyard behind bars in May 1982, just after Margaret Miller was killed, until January 1986, 2 months before the 8 murder spree began. Yet another sexual assault charge against Gilyard in 1989, this one involving a neighbor, led to a suspended sentence and probation under a plea bargain. That incident offered a glimpse into the depth of Gilyard's pathology. The victim and Gilyard had dined and shared a bottle of wine on Halloween Eve. He made sexual advances, and she demurred. He reacted, as usual, with violence. In the middle of the ordeal, the victim said, Gilyard held a knife to his own throat and threatened suicide unless she complied with his sexual demands. Under the plea deal, in that case, Gilyard was required to undergo sex and anger counseling, but it was too late for 12 of the 13 women he killed. Coincidentally, Gilyard became a garbage collector by trade after his release from prison in 1986. His boss at Deffenbach Disposal Service told reporters that Gilyard was punctual, personable, and reliable, and he had been promoted to a supervisory job. After 2 solid decades as a familiar face in Kansas City courtrooms, he seemed to go straight in 1989. Gilyard lived with his 4th wife, whom he married in 1991, in a small house on a dead-end street in South Kansas City. Neighbors told reporters that he rarely spent time outside, and his interactions with others on the block were curt or surly. By 2004, Gilyard must have been confident that he'd gotten away with murder. The investigation into the serial killings had been on ice for years, with forensic evidence sealed and stored. But his past finally caught up with him. Stored evidence from cold cases like the Kansas City murders has gone begging for testing since the advent of DNA crime-solving technology. But Kansas City police, like most departments in America, deplete their laboratory budgets on current cases. Few can afford the time and expense of testing swab samples from the victims of forgotten murders, especially those of prostitutes. But in 2003, Kansas City police won a $111,000 federal grant to pay Lab Gumshoe's overtime to run DNA tests on stored evidence from violent cold cases. Police had evidence stored in some 600 unsolved rapes and murders, and detectives narrowed that down to 85 cases that showed investigative promise. One of them was the murder of Naomi Kelly, the prostitute murdered in 1986. Over 13 months beginning in February 2003, the police scientists amassed 2,500 hours of overtime on nights and weekends in a DNA testing marathon. The work paid off when DNA from the same man was matched in evidence from each of the 8 murders from 1986 and 1987, along with the 5 others from 1977, 1980, 1982, 1989, and 1993. And on April 12, 2004, the white lab coats came up with a name to match the DNA. He was Lorenzo Gilyard, linked to the crimes by DNA extracted from hair or semen found on the victims. He had been right under the police department's nose all along. Gilyard was scrutinized in the serial killings because he was known to cavort with prostitutes, and streetwalkers told cops they were frightened of him. He had agreed to give a blood test in 1987, and cops tailed him at the time but came up with nothing. As forensic DNA testing became more widespread in the 1990s, Kansas City police did not take a second look at the serial killing evidence until the federal grant gave them the financial motivation. Police began following Gilyard again 17 years later while prosecutors prepared a case. After a 5-day tail, detectives arrested him as he ate dinner at Denny's. It was likely his final meal as a free man. A few days after his arrest, a manacled Gilyard, solidly built but with graying hair and mustache, was led into a Kansas City courtroom for a brief hearing. The benches in the chamber were lined with relatives of the women he was accused of murdering. Some wept, but most merely stared. He didn't look remorseful at all, one victim's sister told the Kansas City Star. Although Gilyard made a by-rote claim of innocence, he and his attorney plotted a defense strategy focused not on acquittal but on avoiding execution. After negotiations, Jackson County prosecutor Jim Natsar agreed that he would not seek the death penalty. In exchange, Gilyard agreed to a trial without a jury, and he surrendered most of his rights to appeal a guilty verdict. Natsar said that he made the agreement to ensure a quick, just, and final disposition. But he was also under pressure to win a conviction. In the fall of 2006, Judge John O'Malley threw out much of the evidence against Gilyard due to what he called sloppy work by Kansas City police, both in 1987 and after his arrest in 2004. Yet Natsar still had the idiot-proof DNA evidence, and that was the focus of Gilyard's trial in the spring of 2007. Natsar chose to prosecute Gilyard for 7 of the murders, all from the deadly spree of 1986 and 87. The victims were Ann Barnes, Catherine Berry, Kelly Ford, Carmeline Hibbs, Sheila Ingold, Naomi Kelly, and Angela Mayhew. DNA from semen evidence linked Gilyard to 6 of the 7 women, and a hair provided the evidence in the murder of Mayhew. It was a business-like proceeding, as trials without a jury often are. Gilyard, who seemed a shrunken shadow of the burly man he was when arrested, betrayed no emotion in court, even as Natsar delivered the damning DNA evidence that each of the women died shortly after having sex with the defendant. Defense attorney Thomas Jacquinot argued that Gilyard, who admitted of being a frequent customer of prostitutes, could have been a foil for a murderer who came along after he had sex with the women. But during closing arguments, Natsar countered, the odds of some unknown person shadowing the defendant and killing those women immediately after he had sex with them defies logic. Judge O'Malley didn't buy it either. He convicted Gilyard of 6 counts of murder after trial that lasted just a week. He was judged guilty of the 6 cases with DNA evidence and acquitted in the Mayhew murder. On April 13, 2007, he stood before O'Malley for his comeuppance. When the judge asked the defendant if he had anything to say, Gilyard spoke 8 nihilistic words. "No matter what I say, it doesn't matter." O'Malley then told Gilyard that he had forfeited any right to live out here among the rest of us. Life without parole, the judge decreed, then repeated himself 5 times. Joe Lamb, who covered the trial for the Kansas City Star, wrote that Gilyard's lip quivered as he listened to O'Malley, his only reaction during the entire trial. O'Malley said, "I want Mr. Gilyard to get up every day for the rest of his life, look in the mirror, and say, 'This is what I've done. That's why I'm here.'" But the judge's idealized concept of a daily prison ritual would require a glimmer of conscience, something Lorenzo Gilyard never seemed to display in a lifetime of violence against women. As Gilyard shuffled off into the obscurity of the Missouri prison system, a few relatives of his victims spoke to the press outside the courthouse. One called the conviction a gift I thought we would never receive. Her gratitude is understandable, but it also indicates that the loved ones of murdered prostitutes have low expectations for justice. But should justice be so elusive in these cases? In this era of DNA evidence, someone in the Kansas City Police Department made a curious decision by authorizing a publicity photo featuring members of its newly created Cold Case Squad. In the photo, posted on the police website, the 7 men are pictured wearing untouchable-era fedoras while posed in a cooler amid blocks of ice. It may be true that some cold cases are solved with dogged work by clever detectives, but a more apt cold case publicity photo might show a lab tech using the Riflip technique, or restriction fragment length polymorphism, to compare DNA molecules. That is how the Gilyard case was solved, after languishing in Detective Bureau purgatory for decades. Similarly, DNA testing on old evidence brought Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, to justice in 2003, 21 years and countless detective hours after his spree began. Gilyard is serving his life sentence in Western Missouri Correctional Center. He has pleaded not guilty to the 12 murder charges.